but welcome to the panel on addressing tech debt with site reliability engineering. I'm going to go ahead and introduce some of our speakers and give you a minute to say hello while people are joining. Joe, since you were the last one to join, I'm going to make you go first. So you are the CTO of thoughtbot, and you want to say hello, introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure, yes, as you said, I'm the CTO of thoughtbot. I'm Joe Ferris. I've been at thoughtbot since 2007, which is a time. For the past couple of years, I have been leading our mission control team, which focuses on DevOps support and platform engineering. And so I have gotten extremely into Kubernetes and writing unreasonable amounts of YAML.
That's wonderful. And I didn't even introduce myself. I'm Victoria Guido, the Associate Director for Mission Control at thoughtbot. So I work really closely with Joe all the time now, which is very exciting for me. And I'll also go next to Camille Clayton, who is an engineering manager at Ticketmaster and focuses on Kubernetes infrastructure. She's also the director of Women Who Code, one of the directors who focuses on cloud and DevOps. So welcome, Camille.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. And we have Emmanuel Apau, who is the founder and CEO of Mechanico.io. He's a former United States digital service expert, 5 times AWS certified and certified Kubernetes admin, and also a co-founder of Black Code Collective. So welcome, Emmanuel.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been in the space for a while now, as you've heard from all those accolades, I guess. But yeah, I've been public and private sector, currently focusing on federal contracting these days. So yeah, just looking forward to this conversation because I'm sure it comes up a lot about, how you handle tech debt and what is an SRE and what's DevOps, what's cloud engineering. There's so many terms these days. So really getting into all that stuff.
Yeah, I'm excited, and thank you for queuing that up for me perfectly. So let's just start with kind of a quick lightning round. Like, what is SRE in your own words? And Emmanuel, since you were the last to go, I'll have you go first.
Yeah, sure. So in my opinion, so you have DevOps and now you have DevSecOps, and there's a very large umbrella of many different things, which is infrastructure as code, CI/CD, observability, yada, yada, yada. I think SRE is a subset of all of those different categories. It's a specialty, focusing more purely, well, it's more metrics driven. You're driven behind, is my site up all the time? Is it up 100% of the year or 90% of the year? All the work that you're doing are being driven by these metrics that you establish, unlike some of the other aspects of DevOps.
Great. Camille, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. I would definitely like to add that sort of like an implementation strategy. Google has a great series of books and workbooks on SRE, and that's sort of where the term was coined. But I think today, a lot of the movement is sort of evolving beyond just uptime, but also individual apps, and moving from that platform up to that higher level of application management. It's really interesting to see what's coming on with SLOs.
Thank you. And Joe, do you have anything you want to add to our SRE definition?
Yeah, I think the thing that makes SRE unique to me among the other DevOps approaches I've taken is that it has a pretty prescriptive, in a good way, definition of shared language and agreement, which is really useful as a developer. Like, you're always having these subjective and philosophical arguments about why you should do this or should do that, or what's going to happen, and trying to scare people into making investments. Whereas SRE, like Emmanuel said, is really metrics driven, and it gives you that shared language that you all agree upon about how it's going to work, which you don't get that often in software. So I really like it.
Yeah, and can you expand more on that and maybe start to talk about how SRE can really help you address that technical debt, a key question we're here for today?
Sure. So yeah, it's interesting to talk about SRE and technical debt because it's not that's not one of the original motivations specifically of SRE. It's about reliability and uptime. But what I've found is that issues keeping the site up, or issues deploying frequently while keeping the site up, are frequently signs that there is tech debt that is actively hurting you. And so, like I said, in those tech debt conversations with stakeholders, it can be really difficult to make it concrete to them what something is costing them. Like even the concept of technical debt is already fairly abstract. Whereas you can start to point to real effects in the real world and try and make an argument that the technical debt is what's leading to those real world effects. And because SRE is focused on measuring things that affect users, you're pointing to things that affect their users, and most stakeholders will speak that language.
Yeah. And I guess also maybe for the audience listening in, we defined what SRE was, but maybe it would be good for them to define what tech debt is. And in my opinion, well, as Joe said, sometimes tech debt can be a little hard to define. But if I just give a few little examples, so let's say you have like a bunch of VMs. Tech debt could be maybe those VMs packages are out of date. And so now you know that eventually you need to go back and update them. Or maybe you have in the backlog, you have a whole bunch of issues in the backlog for like enhancements or fixes. We just haven't gone around to it because the business is more focused on features and things like that. But really, I think the real tech debt is the ones that go unwritten down. They're in everybody's heads. A lot of engineers are working places where if you touch this piece of the code, it's going to break everything, but you don't want to bring it up because you don't want to touch it. It's those type of tech debts that scare me as an SRE, because I think the last thing I want to be as an SRE is surprised by anything. If I'm surprised, there's a problem.
Yeah, and Camille, I know that you've been on some projects before where there's a pretty serious amount of tech debt. Have you been able to use SRE to start to address any of that?
Yeah, and the very first phase of an implementation of an SRE team is always investigation, communication, and just sitting down with devs, sitting down with product owners, sitting down with anybody who touches the environment, and just trying to find those things that people don't like to talk about. My favorite break the ice question when I meet like new engineers, like I recently started a new team, a new role about 2 months ago. And my first one-on-one's like, so what's the worst thing here? Everybody loves to answer that one.
I bet you get some animated answers when you ask that, like, well, let me tell you. Oh, that's wonderful. So is that how you get developers excited about SRE?
Well, not necessarily so much SRE, but a lot of tech that whole, I don't want to mention that thing, right? But I think that's reflective of a culture that doesn't listen in part. And people who haven't in recent time had anybody listen to them. And sometimes, especially during that initial forming phase, you're sort of like a tech therapist as an SRE, as an investigative engineer. And then, that hat changes, that evolves, but like definitely those first like month on a new project with a lot of tech debt, you're just listen, eyes open, make sure you're paying attention, and give those people that focus that they may not have had, and that'll get you the answers and that'll help you find what's broken.
Yeah, and if I could just piggyback on that question, you said, how do you get people excited about SRE? One approach that typically works for me is, these days on-call rotations are very popular. And the thing about getting people excited about SRE practices, because you could always pitch, well, if we implement some auto scaling or have some metrics around downtime that we can fix some of these issues, then maybe you can reduce on-call rotations or make sure that the alert goes to the right person. So it's not just like, because usually a lot of times when I've seen on-call rotations in implementation, there's like the first line of defense and they get all of the alerts and then burn out from alert burnout. But I think using the SRE practices is all about, as Camille said, investigative, developing or engineering is finding out who really owns what section and making sure those people get the right alerts.
One thing I really like about SRE that I think speaks to developers is the feeling of safety once you've actually started using it. And if you're paying attention to what it's telling you, developers like shipping features, but a lot of developers are nervous to push to production. And like nobody wants a system that's just one human mistake away from taking down the whole site. And you can use some of the tenets of SRE to make it safer so that people can push their changes and know that if they made a mistake, that the system will prevent it from being catastrophic.
Right. So when we talk about SRE, we also talk a lot about like the developer experience. Like, what is it like to support these systems? What is it like to make changes? And ensuring that that's an enjoyable, exciting time and not a stressful, toil-focused experience. Is there more that you want to say about connecting developers to the SRE concept? Anybody else want to add anything to that?
I kind of want to touch a bit on what Joe was mentioning about confidence in deployments, right? Like what does that mean specifically? Does that mean confidence in our unit tests that we have recovered all of our bases, confidence in our integration tests? I guess I want to hear Joe's opinion on what factors of confidence do you typically try to tackle when people are concerned about failed deployments and things like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one thing that's very hard for developers to figure out abstractly is how close to the edge their system is in production. So you have a certain amount of traffic, you have a certain amount of capacity, and you pull up maybe some neat dashboards that came with whatever your cloud provider is, and it's like, okay, my CPU utilization is 54% most of the time. Is that good? And by starting to measure those things that actually matter to your customers, you can start to see if things get better or worse for your customers as people come onto the site or as you roll out new features. You can actually see what impact you're having. And that can give you the confidence. It's like this one thing I added that added one new database query. I can still see the SLIs are all the same. I can still see I didn't cause anything catastrophic. And I think the second order thing that happens is when you have a culture built around that shared understanding of things like error budgets and SLIs and making sure that everything's measurable, you start to build deployments that inherently try to recover on their own. Like the SRE obsession with automation and having a machine take over as soon as possible in most situations rather than a human pushes us to do things like canary rollouts where you can push a totally broken deploy and it's just not going to deploy. The system will go, actually, I tried to deploy and it breaks all the SLIs, so I'm just not going to deploy it.
Right. And do you have specific strategies for making systems more observable or for making that data easy to access for developers for when they're working through that process? Anybody?
At my current role, we're experimenting with Lightstep. And at my previous role, we had just done our first 2 apps on Jaeger. I think observability is very new and it's very interesting. The power of it, and from what I've seen, because we literally got it up on one of my last days of my last role, and then a small outage happened, and we're able to trace it between 2 different apps where there's contention on the database, and it was like magic. Whereas usually it would have been like, okay, let's get on the bridge, let's pop in. I'm gonna load up Splunk. You have somebody like going from the stakeholder side, and you get in. And you might have to get in the DB if logging isn't getting over to your SIEM. But observability is very much this future of the system already knows what the system did, which a lot, I'm sure all of us here have been in retros where you're like, I think there's a root cause, but observability in a half second can trace that exact transaction that broke you. And I'm super excited to see where it lands as we get more mature implementations. The one hard part with observability is it is not turnkey currently. You have to re-engineer every app to use observability. And so at my current scale, we have 20,000 separate deployments and are currently working to inventory how many exact different application stacks those are. But there's not a global culture of standardization, and observability really needs you to have things standardized. And that's just going to be probably our whole industry's goal for the next 5-6 years.
Yeah, you touched on a great point. Observability is really tough because, as you said, you got to have those conventions that everybody agrees to. And so SREs end up, I want to say 60% of their time just trying to convince people that what you're saying is correct, and then how it'll save them a lot of time and effort. Because one prime example is for example, let's say you're trying to, like you said, you have maybe 20,000 microservices, but you don't have a full map of where the real error happens. So maybe you might want to improve, get observability to your whole, what's that term, the mesh, service mesh or something like that.
Yeah,
That's right. But one concept of that could be like, for example, AWS X-ray. You could pass a header from the beginning of the request untouched and see where it's all the microservices are touched along the way, and that might help you identify which microservice caused which error faster. But you have to convince those engineering teams to make sure that they forward those headers over, unless you're doing something with Kubernetes and using like what's called the sidecars and stuff like that. But yeah, it's a tough problem to solve.
I think one thing we have going for us in my experience is that almost every engineer I've worked with, when they get to see the charts and the graphs and the different visualizations, they love it. And so, getting the initial pass done can be a bit of an effort, but then once they start to see the kind of visibility they get, it's addictive and they start to do it on their own. I've been really excited by open telemetry, which is an effort to standardize the big three: observability, logs, metrics, and traces. And I've already seen some pretty interesting gains there, like tying those three things together in any kind of visualization is really powerful. And it seems like that's where everybody is moving.
No, that's great. And we'll be sharing out links to all of these references as well after the event. So that's kind of where you can get to with SRE, right? The future, where it's going. What about if you're like just getting started and you're just hearing about all these things for the first time? Where would you tell people to begin their SRE journey?
That's a great question. It leads me to a great opportunity to pitch my class on Udacity. So check out my course on becoming an SRE. But if you don't want to pay, there's a lot of free resources out there. I would say if you're new, if you want to get into SRE, I would say maybe start with a solid foundation and understanding maybe the cloud service that you're working in. So maybe if you're working primarily in AWS, maybe using the education curriculum to get like an AWS cert might help solidify your foundation. What are my options available? And that might help you, when you decide to dive a little deeper into the SRE principles.
Right. And I always tell people there's also an AWS developer cert. So I know some developers are hesitant about getting an AWS cert, but there is a track just for developers if that's what you're into. Camille, were you going to add something to what Emmanuel said?
My start was honestly just a couple months after that SRE book hit. I slapped down that wherever the horrendous fee from for hardcover O'Reilly was back when 4 or 5 rolls ago. And I poured over those essays. It's a real touchstone for thinking about systems. And I think that's something like as we get further into it and it's more common, we move away from like that theory and more into implementation. The best thing I have found, honestly, is being flexible. I've had the ask of, hey, so everything is running mostly on AWS. We got a little VMware. What if we moved everything to Azure? What if we move things back to on-prem? And as you move in your career, like being able to think about systems as sort of generics is really fascinating. And SRE, I think, thrives in being able to handle unknowns. that's my only 2 cents. I say that as I'm right there with you. Like the AWS certs have been super valuable, but just take in as much as you can.
Right. And of course, Women Who Code has a whole cloud and DevOps series, I believe, that creates a lot of great content around maybe not SRE specifically, but general DevOpsy type skills. And Joe, were you going to add something to that?
I was just going to add, if you're a person who's new to SRE, but your organization does SRE, that can be a really great advantage, because I have found that SRE is much easier to touch and feel. Like you can go and see the dashboard for your service and look at the SLIs. It clicks so much faster than even the examples in the workbooks. Like I wish there was a publicly available version of it somewhere where there was like some dummy site that had actual traffic going to it. You could go and the dashboards and the logs and look at it, because seeing the living, breathing artifacts of SRE is so much more compelling than, you know, the theories or even the screenshots in the workbook.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe we'll make one, a public SRE project right after this. No, that sounds good. What were you gonna say, Emmanuel? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm surprised that maybe New Relic and Datadog don't have like a dashboard that shows like, here's a dummy website, all the metrics and things and traces and stuff like that. Yeah, that would be maybe a good pitch to them. I don't know.
I think that makes sense. And you know, there's different decisions to make, different trade-offs between every decision you make around your platform and what you include. Do you want to talk more, Camille? You started to mention, like, if you want to go to Azure, you want to go to AWS, what types of things do you think about when you're choosing your platform or choosing your tooling that affect SRE capabilities? You, sir, Camille, anybody?
Tooling is hard. Tooling is possibly the most accurate indicator of culture I've ever found. And ultimately, like, being successful, because part of being an SRE, part of rotating through different dev teams and assisting you know, the organization as a whole, is being able to adapt to the variety of tooling. I have kept myself familiar with Bash, PowerShell, and Python. I don't super customize my systems. And I try to, you know, flow like water, and tooling wise, you know, keep it open like a Swiss Army knife. I find that's sort of what keeps me above water.
Yeah, I would say I usually lean more to the cloud agnostic tooling, just because multi-cloud is becoming so popular these days. And, you know, AWS had the monopoly for a while, but Azure is quickly catching up. So when you start focusing too much, like say you're doing infrastructure as code, if your focus is 100% on AWS and all you know is CloudFormation, then when you need to now transition to Azure and figure out how they do things with their different JSON blobs, things get a little bit difficult. So I like Terraform because it's cloud agnostic. I just have to learn one thing, but I can use it with any cloud provider. Not even just a cloud provider. I mean, you could use it to infrastructure as code, your Splunk alerts, infrastructure as code, your GitHub repos. You can build your own providers. So when it comes to tooling, I usually try and lean towards the cloud agnostic ones.
I'm also a big proponent of open source tooling, which will tend to be cloud agnostic. I think if you can find something that's open source and has been successful enough that AWS is forced to support it in some way, then it's probably a good bet. Like Kubernetes is a great example. AWS had their own platform for so long with ECS, but Kubernetes was so popular, they were like, we have to go in on this. That's a good sign.
That makes a lot of sense. And there's so many options out there for what tools you can include. I think those guardrails of, like, if it's open source and if it's flexible, those are the two big criteria that you want to adapt to your teams. And it also sounds like, you know, if it's something that's common that other people might have previous experience with, that's also a plus, right? Excellent. So we've talked a lot about specific technologies and a lot of different practices. What if you're an organization that's like completely new to SRE? how would you talk to them about it? Talk to these senior leaders at companies running tech shops who haven't heard of SRE. Like, how do you approach them on the topic? Might be a lot. And maybe Joe, do you want to start since you do that a lot, most likely?
Sure. I think one thing SRE has going for it is you try to measure things that users will care about. So it's not as abstract as some things could be. And you can pretty quickly get together a working example. Like observability is a hard problem, but getting a quick end-to-end, request per second response time graph that shows here's how your site has been performing for the past week, you can get that together pretty quickly, bring it to leadership and show them like, this is the real effect. I can show you that the way things are set up right now, every time you deploy, the site is slow for 10 seconds. And that matters to people. And that just buying that little bit of trust means they will listen to the rest of what you have to say, at least for a little while.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think it's very, I think it's important to bring up the SL, I guess it's the SLOs, like the specific goals for the website that you would say that is functional, because you have all the technical aspects like uptime or lag or things like that. But let's say your business has like a Google form, and you're able to track that maybe 75% of users don't ever get past a certain step. But your SLO might be you want people to get through the entire form. That might also lead to tech debt. Maybe there might be features or tech debt that's preventing certain users from getting past certain steps. Maybe there's bugs. And then you can see over time, as you fix these different bugs, these different tech debts that you're resolving, that percentage is going up. And that's kind of like your service level agreement for the company saying 100% of the time our users can get through our Google form without any major issues. And I think when you tie those metrics to business outcomes, that's what usually gets the business happy, like, oh, because they don't care about CPU utilization. It went from 60% to 80%. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? But if that means your customers are making it all the way through to checkout, then that they might want to know about that. So I think that's a strategy a lot of SREs tend to use for getting their automation in place to help resolve these type of tech debt issues.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point about SRE is that it doesn't make any excuses. There are no exceptions. Like when you measure the amount of time it takes to do something, you're measuring the whole time. And you don't try to say like, well, this part doesn't count. Like, I have clients who have to process payments. So when they're detecting how long it takes to process a payment, you include their payment processor because you're only ever as good as your payment processor. And so if that starts to get slow, then it actually helps you make some interesting business decisions. Like we really did have a client look at the performance of their site with a specific payment processor and decide to move to an alternative because that was just as good as they were going to get.
That's super fascinating on like the retail side. I spent 7 years doing retail, both on the floor and then in the IT area. But like Costco, if you ever go to Costco, their payments are super fast because they found out people will just abandon stuff. If it's slow, they won't come back. So they pay for high-speed internet at every location. I've seen the exact opposite of like, what's the cheapest internet we can get for our credit cards? And it's fascinating what will and won't push consumers as well as just users in general.
Right. And that's what I find the most exciting about SRE is that there's this design aspect to it, right? And sometimes I'll ask designers, what does DevOps have to do with design? And they'll say, nothing. I'm like, that's not true. When I read the SRE and I talked about error budgets, you really have to understand what is the user's experience with your site and with your business, and then coming up with those metrics that identify whether or not their experience was successful or not. So I love what you all have said. It really ties that all together. Is there other aspects of SRE that kind of talk to that design or that user experience? And we have the end user experience, and then we also have the developer's experience, right? You want to add anything in there?
I'll let you go. Yeah.
I think from a design aspect, designers tend to understand it. Like, I think sort of the first nuances of like of SRE came with like helping redesign a website. And the graphic designer was like, it's really fast on this computer and it's really slow on this computer. And why? And I was like, well, this computer's pretty slow, and this, how the website's engine, we found we're on our intranet, was actually holding the data as a bit stream. Love some Eastern European technology. And then was manually recompiling and rendering the images. And so on a Chromebook, it took a long time. On the desktops we did all our testing on, it was lightning quick. So I think design tends to understand the user impact a little closer than backend dev. But I think, like Emmanuel and Joe both said at various points, like showing devs those usable dashboards, those usable observability threading metrics, it tends to sort of gamify it for them. And there's a natural push to get as close as you can to 100% or whatever is green for your metric bar.
Yeah, I think one place that's really close to design is as observability pushes closer to the edge, like Camille, you had mentioned earlier, how they're starting to measure apps and not just backend. And we've started doing some metrics for our front end apps, like in React. And it's interesting to be able to show a designer what the cost of a design decision is in terms of page load time with real data.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Emmanuel, did you have something you were going to add there?
Now I'm kind of curious on your experience with like, for example, the front end impact with designers and how that conversation goes, and are they receptive, you know, to the metrics that you're showing them. I'm kind of curious how that kind of typically happens on a day-to-day, because sometimes sometimes it can be even with clear-cut evidence in people's faces, it can still be a conversation to say, yeah, maybe let's not go down this design path, even though this is what you really want, because it does cause these impacts. I'm kind of curious from y'all's experiences how those conversations have gone.
I think it's a matter of how often you're having conversations with the designers. I find overall, like, it's always easier to help, convince, nudge, persuade, however you want to call it, the people I talk to the most. And so honestly, I spend a ton of time just prioritizing who and what conversations I'm going to have. I block out time every Monday and I try and figure out who I need to talk to the most, even if it's just 15 minutes. It makes a lot of difference. It's also something that doesn't happen. Like it's a forcing function you have to do when you're working fully remote, where you have to schedule meetings with people. Mm-hmm. And I think it was more unconscious. People just didn't do that when they were at the office because they would see people and be like, oh, I'll talk to this person. So it's interesting as we move to remote cultures, hybrid cultures, how to take what may have happened in sort of, the ether and making it more of a static reality.
Yeah, and I think you're 100% spot on about it is really also relationship building, and that gets it's easier in smaller teams, harder in larger organizations. And I do remember in the previous company I used to work at, the SREs that I was leading, I made it a point that we, at least one of us, if we're going to implement, like, let's say some SLOs with the application team, that we join their stand-ups periodically so that they can see a name to a face, and we can gain a better understanding as to the what's going on with the application, what tools are they using. So for example, let's say our metrics aggregator is New Relic, and I'm not saying, okay, I want y'all to send this SLI metric to New Relic using our Python helper script, but they all only know Node. They now need to it helps resolve these type of conflicts in larger organizations when SREs are more embedded with the application team.
Yeah, and Joe, I don't know what your past experience has been at thoughtbot working with designers and different dev teams on SRE and how those interactions have gone.
Yeah, it's new territory for me, but in SRE, as in all things, I have found that when we take a design-driven approach, we are more successful. That it's very easy as developers to jump to a solution, especially if it's an interesting solution. But if you take a step back and really look at the design first, you usually come up with a better solution. One interesting, anecdote from my experience with design and SRE is I found that frequently what the data we get from SRE tells us helps the designers make the case for what they wanted to do anyway. I guess one example, we had a page that was fully server rendered, and it was very simple in terms of its implementation, and the UI was pretty clunky, but it was a in-house UI. You had to use it. It wasn't really like we weren't going to lose customers, and so people were reluctant to invest in it, but designers wanted to make it nicer. And we ended up doing this spike where they had a more dynamic version of the UI, and they were able to demonstrate from the data we happened to be collecting for SRE that they were able to process orders much faster if we gave them a slightly better UI, and then they built that UI. So I think it's useful for designers in the same way it's useful for developers, where you get that real common understood talking point of hard data. You can actually look at graphs and show somebody what the effect of something is.
Right. And we've talked about SRE in the context of like large organizations or teams that already have an existing product. Is there a specific time when companies or startups might actually start considering about SRE? Do you think about it first before you build it, or is it come up naturally in the life cycle? And maybe Joe, you want to start again since you.
Sure. I think people have brought up already that it can be difficult to implement SRE if you haven't thought about observability from the beginning. And so it does make sense to start early. What I recommend to clients in terms of when they actually implement SREs, meaning when they implement SRE, meaning that they have they've agreed on SLOs and they have an error budget and agree what happens, is that they do that as soon as they have actual user traffic, because that's the point at which you probably want to have actual pager alerts. Like if the site goes down, you want somebody to do something about it. And that in that situation, you're immediately confronted with all the questions that SRE is designed to answer. Like, who should we page? When should we page them? What should we alert about? What should we be tracking? How do we decide if it's good enough? And so you can't really get away with that. Like as soon as you have real traffic, you have all of the problems that SRE solves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Emmanuel and Camille, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think that was spot on. I was trying to think, is there anything else I want to add? But no, I think Joe covered really the core of it, which is the moment you start getting that real user traffic, that's when you should start thinking about all the different aspects of being an SRE and the different metrics you want to track.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I do want to make sure we have plenty of time to wrap up and for you guys to give your shout outs and everything. I want to see if anyone in the audience has a question they want to ask. I think you can raise your hand, and you can also message me in the chat if anybody has any additional questions. And while people are maybe posting some extra questions, let me ask something more fun. Like, what SRE related tool are you most excited about experimenting with next?
I'm not quite sure, just because the tool I'm going to be looking at is Lightstep. But in fun tools for Kubernetes, I've discovered Lins. And we run both on-prem and cloud Kubernetes, so there's not a single pane of glass available. And Lins brings that to my desktop instantly from my kube config, and I've been playing with it for like 2-3 days, and I am absolutely fascinated and in love with it.
That sounds very cool. Yeah, for folks who might not know, Ticketmaster is like a 40-year-old company with lots of different applications. How many different application teams do you guys have? Or give us some sense of scope on Ticketmaster?
So We're running millions of transactions into billions of transactions on peak sales days. And we're running an average of just in the cloud, 20,000 different deployments. And then we have a ton of legacy spread globally. We're working on expanding our global cloud footprint. We've recently gone to Europe, and we are going to be in Australia by end of year.
Wow, that's so exciting. Very cool. Emmanuel, do you have any exciting new tools that you're messing around with?
I have a tool I want to revisit. A while ago, well, maybe not that long ago, but AWS pushed out a new framework called CDK, which is kind of like infrastructure as code, except you're not writing YAML or Terraform ACL. It's just you're writing code using the same languages that you know, TypeScript or Python. They now have CDK for Terraform, which I think is interesting. So I want to circle back to that and see what it's like to write regular code, but implements the Terraform API and have things work that way. Because I could foresee that being an easier transition for kind of pulling in more engineers to write more infrastructure as code. Because I mean, the whole idea of DevOps is that it's supposed to be a symbiosis between the devs and the ops folks. And the simplest way to do that is, I think, is that ramp up on languages. And if we're all writing the same language, then we can all do the same stuff.
Yeah, that sounds very cool. Very DevOpsy focused.
It's really interesting to hear that Terraform is building a CDK, because CDK for Terraform is exactly how I would have described Pulumi.
Yeah, that's another one I haven't had a chance to check out. Have you played around with that?
I played around with it. I don't want to spoil the ending, but I went back to Terraform.
Long story short, I'm sure. No, that's cool.
I think I've already mentioned my tool that I'm most excited about, which is a kind of new effort, open telemetry, which is aiming to standardize, you know, as we mentioned, it's a hard problem. But in addition to it being really cool, I think it's a very big opportunity for people who are looking to get into open source, because it's a defined problem that they need help with. And so if you go to OpenTelemetry for whatever your language is, whatever your framework is, you'll find that there are improvements you can make without having to be super creative in terms of adding telemetry for your platform. So super cool project. And if you are looking to get involved in open source, I think it would be a great place to start.
That's great. Well, thank you for that, Joe. I think that's definitely something we're all going to take a look at later, and we'll include all of these references for people after the event. So it's at 1:45, and I think what we'll do to wrap up is to just give you each some time to shout out if you're hiring or if you have new projects you want people to get involved in. I'll start with Camille if you want to share anything with us, anything you want to promote.
Ticketmaster Live Nation is having a really big hiring push. You can check out the career site on livenation.com. If you find any roles, feel free to reach out to me. I'm on Twitter. You can also reach me via email. I'm sure it'll be in the notes. I have lately had a little side project. If you're working remote or you're thinking about going back to the office full-time or part-time, feel free to check it out at remoteworkcalc.com. It's really fascinating to see what remote may be worth to you. And beyond that, I'm excited to kick off in August a new series of cloud topics for Women in Code.
Very cool. Yeah, I'll be there attending. Emmanuel, do you have stuff you want to talk about?
Yeah, sure. So Mechanicode is hiring. Mechanicode is a company that I run that we do mainly cloud engineering and DevOps focus contracting for the federal government. So if you're interested in helping modernize the government and help improve their cloud practices and all of that, check out Mechanicode, our careers page. I'll probably get that, work with Victoria to send that out in the email or something. But we're hiring senior DevOps engineers, cloud architects. And then, you know, once again, check out my course on SRE at Udacity. That's always a good one. And of course, there's Black Code Collective. If you're interested in a space for Black engineers to kind of ask the hard questions, or just, you know, to build some camaraderie with other Black engineers in the tech space, we have a very active Slack channel, so check us out over there. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
That's great. Yeah, and I want to give a shout out. Some people think that government work is always traditional on-prem, but there are government teams out there who are deploying 25 times a day, and they're in AWS and very modern. So I'm sure that's more like the projects that you're working on there, which is very exciting. Great. Thank you, Emmanuel. And Joe, you want to talk about anything?
Yeah, I mean, as always, I'd love to talk about thoughtbot. We are a consultancy, and we do help people with their scalability and reliability problems. If you have a team that's either interested in or adopting SRE, and you would like a seasoned hand to help you through that process and get you to that first beautiful graph that you can build on, we would be very excited to help you get there.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, and you can work with both of us, and we're so fun. And yeah, definitely reach out if you have any interest or want to chat about that. And I'm sure we'll be having more events talking about different DevOpsy SRE topics. So if any of the attendees have something they want to dive more into, you can reach out to me directly and let me know, and we can organize something around it. If it won't be a thoughtbot event, it could be a Women Who Code event or a Black Code Collective event. But thank you all for joining. I certainly miss you both from being in the DC tech meetup scene. So thanks for joining me today. And thanks, Joe, for coming on this afternoon. I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up and give everybody 10 more minutes back of their day. And this video will be shared online afterwards, and we'll follow up with more resources after this. So thanks, everybody.